In the British Museum, there is a banknote from a country you will not find on any map. Not because it fell, not because it was renamed, because it never existed. The note is beautifully engraved. Bank of Poyais, $1 hard. Real printers made it. Real people earned real wages and exchanged them for this. In 1822, the most sophisticated financial market on earth priced this country's bonds beside those of Chile and Peru. Lords bought them, bankers blessed them. 2,000 certificates at £100 apiece. 250 immigrants sailed to settle it. They carried its currency. They wore its uniforms. They held its royal appointments. What they found was an empty shore. More than half of them died there. No one was ever punished. And the man responsible was buried a hero, full military honors, in a cathedral. This is the Con Files. File number 1. Poyais, the country that never was, and the market that never checked. It begins in the Scottish Highlands, with a clan whose name was once a crime, and a boy who learned that a story, told with total confidence, is worth money. Gregor MacGregor was born in 1786 on the banks of Loch Katrine in the Scottish Highlands. His clan had a problem, and the problem was its own name. Clan Gregor had spent generations outlawed, the name itself banned by royal decree. Their most famous son was Rob Roy MacGregor. Outlaw, folk hero, romantic legend, Gregor would spend his whole life telling people Rob Roy was his ancestor. And in 1817, 4 years before MacGregor's return to London, Walter Scott published a novel called Rob Roy. It was the sensation of the decade. Britain fell in love with the romantic Highland outlaw, just in time for a man with the same surname to walk into its drawing rooms. Understand the Scotland he came from, too. The Highlands were emptying, rents rising, crofts cleared, whole villages choosing between the poorhouse and the immigrant ship. For thousands of ordinary Scots, leaving was already decided. The only open question was where. Hold that thought. Notice what he learned first. Before anything else, a name is a story, and a story told with total confidence is worth money. At 16, his family bought him a commission in the British Army. This was normal rank, was openly for sale. Within a year, they bought him another promotion. Gregor MacGregor learned his second lesson. Institutions sell legitimacy to anyone who can pay. His actual military career was brief and quarrelsome garrison duty, a posting to Gibraltar, a dispute with a superior officer, and a quiet exit from the army before the dispute could become a record. Leave before the consequences arrive. He would perfect that maneuver for 40 years. He married well Maria Bowater, daughter of a Royal Navy admiral. Her family's money bought him the rank of major. He began, quietly, calling himself Sir Gregor. No one had knighted him. No one checked. No one checked. Write that phrase down. It is the engine of everything that follows. In 1811, Maria died. The admiral's money died with her. MacGregor was 25, a half-pay ex-officer with expensive habits, a fabricated knighthood, and no income to support the character he was playing. So he did what ambitious, unverifiable men did in 1812. He sailed for South America, where a continent was on fire, and nobody could check anything at all. Venezuela was fighting for independence from Spain. Foreign officers were pouring in, and the revolution took MacGregor at his own valuation. The valuation was, of course, inflated. He arrived a retired major. He introduced himself as Sir Gregor MacGregor, Baronet, and was made a colonel within weeks. He stepped into an apocalypse dressed as a war. In March 1812, an earthquake had leveled Caracas and killed thousands of priests. Were preaching that God favored Spain. The revolution was broke, superstitious, and desperate for professional officers. A confident European major was worth his weight in muskets. He also watched what happened to founders. Francisco de Miranda, the revolution's father, surrendered, was handed to the Spanish by his own allies, and would die 4 years later, chained in a Spanish prison cell near Cadiz. MacGregor took the lesson that would define him. Causes devour the men who stay too long. Here's what makes this story uncomfortable. He was good, genuinely good. He fought under Francisco de Miranda. He married Josefa Aristeguieta, a cousin of Simón Bolívar himself. He rose to general. This was real. In 1816, He led a fighting retreat from Okamare, a month of running battles that saved hundreds of soldiers and became genuinely famous. Songs were written. Bolivar praised him. The legend, for once, was earned. 34 days of rearguard actions, river crossings, jungle marches outnumbered the whole way. Admirers called him the Xenophon of the Americas, after the Greek general who marched 10,000 men home through hostile country. For once, the comparison was earned rather than purchased. And note what he did with the glory. He minted it. MacGregor struck a commemorative medal celebrating his own retreat, cast in his own honor, distributed to his own circle. Most men wait for institutions to decorate them. He had discovered that institutions rarely audit the decorations. Remember that. The most dangerous con artists are not pure liars. They are people with one true story who learn how much a true story can carry. Because the next chapters were not true stories. In 1817, MacGregor seized Amelia Island, a Spanish outpost off Florida, with a few dozen men. He declared it the and he began selling things. Land script, commissions, paper backed by a republic that was 9 weeks old and the size of a village. Then, when the money thinned and real soldiers approached, he sailed away in the night, leaving his followers to sort out the wreckage. The Amelia money had come from backers in Charleston and Savannah merchants who advanced funds against promised Florida land. When MacGregor sailed off, their claims evaporated with him. The paper he printed outlived his presence. It always would. That was the discovery. Amelia Island itself descended into a pirate's republic under a French corsair before the United States Navy ended the experiment entirely. Total lifespan of the Republic of the Floridas: months. Total consequences for its founder: none. He was already gone, reputation somehow intact. Amelia Island was not a country. It was a rehearsal. A proof of concept with a body count of nearly 0 this time. 2 years later came the darker rehearsal. Leading an expedition against Portobello, MacGregor bungled the defense and escaped through a window while his men were captured. At Rio de la Hacha, it happened again. He sailed off and left hundreds of volunteers to die or rot in Spanish prisons. Portobello deserves the detail. When Spanish forces retook the town at dawn, the general commanding MacGregor escaped through his bedroom window and swam to the ships, leaving some 200 of his men to be captured. Some were imprisoned for years. Some did not survive. At Rio de la Hacha, the sequel, a chaotic assault, a doomed occupation, and another seaborne exit. While the volunteers he had recruited, many of them Irish veterans lured by pay that never came faced Spanish justice without him. The London press printed the survivors' accounts. Briefly, the pattern was now complete and public. Dazzling promises, real charisma, genuine early success, then abandonment, at the exact moment his followers needed him most. Anyone in London could have learned this. It had been in the newspapers. No one checked. In 1820, MacGregor washed up on the Mosquito Coast, a strip of Caribbean shoreline in what is now Honduras and Nicaragua. Britain had abandoned its settlements there decades earlier. The land was nominally ruled by the king of the Mosquito people, George Frederick Augustus. King George Frederick liked gifts, and MacGregor brought rum and jewelry. In April 1820, the king signed away roughly 8 million acres around the Black River, an area larger than Wales, to General Gregor MacGregor. What did 8 million acres cost him? By the accounts that survive, rum, jewelry, and flattery for King George Frederick Augustus, a ruler who had grown up around British traders and signed what he understood as a generous land lease to a famous general. Sovereignty was never his to give, and never his intention. The grant was real, as far as it went. But it came with conditions the king understood perfectly. It conferred land, not sovereignty. It did not make MacGregor a prince. It did not create a state. It was a very large, very empty piece of paper. And the land itself? Swamp, jungle, and sand? The British had tried to settle the Black River before and given up. Nothing was there. Nothing had ever been there. An honest man sees 8 million worthless acres. Gregor MacGregor saw something else entirely. He saw that the distance between London and the Mosquito Coast was 4,000 miles and 4 months of sailing. He saw that in London, this paper could be anything he said it was. One more piece of context makes the whole machine click. Post-Napoleonic Britain was oversupplied with exactly two things: half-pay officers with no war to fight, and idle capital with nowhere respectable to earn. MacGregor's scheme was custom-built to harvest both rank for the restless, yield for the rich. Here is the first mechanism, plainly stated. Every con needs an information vacuum, a place the mark cannot easily verify. In 1821, Central America was to London what an offshore server is today, a place where claims go to become uncheckable. London, 1821. MacGregor stepped off the boat with a new name, His Serene Highness Gregor I, Sovereign Prince of Poyais, Cazique of the Poyais Nation. Poyais. He had invented the word. It sounded vaguely native, vaguely romantic, and totally specific. Not my lands on the Mosquito Coast. A nation. With a name, a flag, a coat of arms, and a national anthem. He had commissioned all of them. His timing was not luck, it was the whole trick. Britain in the early 1820s was drowning in cheap money. Government bonds paid almost nothing, and a mania had seized the city. Latin American debt? The numbers behind the mania. British government consuls paid roughly 3%. The new Latin American republics dangled 6%. In the early 1820s, London floated tens of millions of pounds to states that had existed for minutes, some of which would default before the ink dried. Poyais did not invent the appetite. It catered it. The new republics Colombia, Chile, Peru were floating loans on the London Exchange, and investors were fighting to buy them. Exotic, patriotic, high yield. Everyone knew someone getting rich on countries they could not find on a map. So, when a decorated general, a hero of the liberation wars, married into Bolivar's own family, received in the best drawing rooms, offered London a brand new Central American state, he was not fighting the current. He was the current. The Lord Mayor of London hosted him. Officials treated the cazique like visiting royalty. He opened a Poyais legation office. He appointed consuls. He sold commissions in the Poyais army and navy to ambitious young men cash for rank, exactly as Britain had once sold rank to him. He gave the operation a physical address, a Poyais office in the city, staffed, papered, and busy. Deeds were notarized. Ledgers were kept. Fraud at this scale is mostly administration, and MacGregor ran his fiction with better clerical discipline than some real colonies of the era. He designed the uniforms himself, greencoats for the officers of a non-existent army, and men of good family paid real money to wear them. Each commission came with documents, precedents, and the small daily theater of being addressed by rank. The costume did half the convincing. Stop and appreciate the architecture. Each sold commission created a stakeholder, a man now personally invested in Poyais being real. Every officer of the Poyais Navy walking around London was a walking testimonial who had paid for the privilege. This is the second mechanism, borrowed and multiplied credibility. The con does not ask you to trust the con man. It asks you to trust the crowd around him, and the crowd was bought, flattered, or fooled into existence. By early 1822, the apparatus was complete. A sovereign prince, a legation, a flag, an army in waiting. A nation with everything a nation needs, except land that mattered, people, buildings, or existence. What it still lacked was the masterpiece, the evidence. That year, London booksellers received a handsome 350-page volume, Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, including The Territory of Poyais. Author, Captain Thomas Strangeways, aide-de-camp to the cazique. Thomas Strangeways did not exist. MacGregor had fabricated his own independent source. The book described the capital, St. Joseph, broad boulevards, colonnaded public buildings, a domed cathedral, a theater, an opera house, and the Bank of Poyais. It described soil so fertile it yielded 3 maize harvests a year, rivers that ran over, beds flecked with gold, trees that practically dropped medicine. Much of the book was not even original invention. It borrowed liberally from older, genuine accounts of the Mosquito Shore, splicing real geography beneath fabricated cities. That is what made it so hard to falsify. The parts a reader could check were true. The parts that mattered were not. Almost every word was invented, but it had page numbers, it had tables, it had appendices and coordinates, and the texture of scholarship. In 1822, A printed book was a truth machine. Nobody assumed a con artist would go to the trouble of writing one. Respectable journals discussed it. Extracts circulated in the papers alongside emigration notices. The book reviewed as geography, not as prospectus, which meant the sales document for the scheme entered the public record wearing the byline of an independent expert who had never existed. Mechanism 3. The fabricated artifact. Build the evidence your victims would have asked for before they ask. A fake guidebook in 1822. A fake audit. A glossy white paper. A rigged demo today. The document is the con, wearing the costume of proof. The stage was dressed. The book was in the shops. The prince was in the papers. Act 1 of the con was complete, and MacGregor had not yet taken the real money. That came next, through the front door of the London Stock Exchange. October the 23rd, 1822. The banking house of Sir John Perring, a former Lord Mayor of London, brought a new security to market. A £200,000 loan to the government of Poyais. 2,000 bearer bonds. £100 each. Read that again. A non-existent country issued sovereign debt on the world's most important exchange, underwritten by a former Lord Mayor's bank. The bonds were priced alongside the debt of Chile and Peru, real nations, and for a while, they traded respectably. The mechanics were textbook for the era, issued below face value through respectable intermediaries, serviced by a sinking fund that existed on paper, marketed beside the bonds of Colombia, Chile, and Peru. On the exchange ticker, a fictional nation and a real one look, identical. Why did the city swallow it? Because the wrapper was perfect. Sovereign bonds were the respectable mania of the moment. The paperwork was orthodox. The bank was real. The general was famous. Every individual element checked out. Except the one element nobody priced. The country. Mechanism 4. The legitimate wrapper. Fraud rarely invents new containers. It borrows the most trusted container of its era. A sovereign bond, a brokerage statement, an exchange listing, and pours nothing into it. The container does the convincing. But bonds were only half the harvest. The other half was people. Because a country with no population is a hard story to keep telling. Poyais needed settlers, and settlers, conveniently, pay for the privilege. MacGregor opened land offices in London, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. Poyais land sold at 2 shillings and 3 pence an acre, a laborer's daydream. Prices rose steadily, which itself became the sales pitch. Buy now, before the next price rise. Watch the price arc. It is the con inside the con. 2 shillings 3 pence an acre at launch, climbing toward 4 shillings as demand grew. Each rise was proof the last buyers had chosen wisely, and a deadline for the next. He had discovered momentum marketing for dirt he had never seen. He aimed the Scottish campaign with particular care at his own people. Clan pride, a Highland prince building a new Scotland in the sun. Hundreds of ordinary Scots, farmers, tradesmen, clerks converted their life savings into deeds for jungle they had never seen. He recruited the skilled by flattery and title. A young Edinburgh cobbler was appointed official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais. A banker was engaged to run the Bank of Poyais. Doctors, teachers, civil officers, each handed a role in a government that existed only as stationary. Read the passenger manifests, and the scheme's cruelty sharpens. Half-pay lieutenants taking Poyais commissions to feel useful again. A gardener engaged for the cazique's estates. Clerks promised government desks in St. Joseph. These were not greedy speculators. They were people offered their old lives back somewhere warmer. And then, the detail that removes any possible doubt about intent. Before departure, immigrants were encouraged to exchange their British pounds and Scottish banknotes for Poyais dollars, printed in Scotland, on MacGregor's order, by the same firm that printed real banknotes. Think about what that exchange actually was. Real money in souvenir paper out. It was framed as a convenience. Of course, a nation has a currency. It was, functionally, the cleanest theft in the entire scheme. He took their cash and handed them the con itself as a receipt. Mechanism 5. Extraction disguised as procedure. The moment money moves is dressed as paperwork, an exchange, a fee, a conversion, a staking step. Nobody feels robbed while they are complying with process. and the first believers had already sailed. On the 10th of September, 1822, 6 weeks before the bond even reached the exchange, the Honduras packet had cleared London with roughly 70 settlers aboard, the advance party of the new nation, carrying tools, trunks, letters of appointment, and Poyais dollars. The money machine and the human cargo ran on parallel tracks. Among them, the banker for the Bank of Poyais, the official shoemaker, men who had thrown over real careers. On the dock, a band, toast to the cazique. It looked everyone agreed like the founding of something. The send-off had an anthem, of course it did. MacGregor had commissioned one, and dockside accounts described toasts to the cazique and his princess as the Honduras packet warped out into the river. Nations have anthems. That was the entire logic. Anthem, therefore nation. 4 months later, on the 22nd of January, 1823, the Kennersley Castle sailed from Leith with around 200 more women, children, whole families this time. MacGregor came aboard to see them off. He announced, grandly, that as natives of his own Scotland, their passage was free. He worked the Leith departure personally, the prince among his immigrants, granting free passage to fellow Scots with theatrical generosity, blessing children, accepting gratitude. Men who shook his hand that day would bury those children on his imaginary coast within 6 months. Free passage. A small kindness from a prince or a man making sure the evidence sailed 4,000 miles away from the courts. With 270 people now committed, Poyais had achieved something remarkable. It had exported its own witnesses. In London, the machine hummed on. Bonds traded. Land sold. The book sat in the shops. And somewhere in the Atlantic, 2 shiploads of believers sailed toward the moment this story has been circling since its first frame. The Honduras packet made landfall at the Black River in November 1822. The settlers came up on deck to see their capital. St. Joseph, the boulevards, the cathedral, the opera house, the bank that several of them worked for. The landing itself had the discipline of belief. Baggage ferried ashore by longboat, stores stacked above the tide line, a flag raised, proclamations read aloud to the jungle in the name of Gregor I. They behaved, in every particular, like the vanguard of a nation because that is what they had paid to be. The shore was empty, not underdeveloped, not smaller than advertised. Empty. Sand, swamp, and forest. The only trace of human hands. A few rotted foundations of a British settlement abandoned 40 years before, being eaten by the jungle. Somebody suggested the obvious. The captain has the wrong bay. They sounded the coast. They sent parties inland. They found the river. They found the swamp. They did not find St. Joseph, because there had never been a St. Joseph to find. Authority on the beach fell to a Colonel Hector Hall, a real officer holding a commission from an unreal country who organized shelters, rationed stores, and kept sending search parties for a capital he increasingly suspected did not exist. He would spend months holding together a colony with no country behind it. Here is the cruelest part. They did not conclude they had been conned. They concluded they were early. The book was so detailed, the prince so plausible, their commitment so total, that the settlers decided the city must simply be elsewhere, and they pitched camp to wait. This is the midpoint of the con, and it is the moment worth studying above all others. When evidence and belief collide, belief does not die quietly. The victims will do the con artist's work for him, long after he has stopped. Then their ship left. The Honduras packet, driven off by weather and out of patience, disappeared over the horizon, taking with it the settlers' only way out. 70 people, on a fever coast, with tools for a city and nothing to build one from. Accounts differ on the ship's departure, a dispute with the captain, weather, an errand up the coast that never returned. What no account disputes is the arithmetic it left behind. 70 settlers, 1 fever coast, 0 vessels. The colony of Poyais was now, in every sense, marooned. And in March, hope arrived in the worst possible form. The Kennersley Castle, with 200 more believers. The advance party watched the newcomers row ashore, scanning the beach for the capital, and understood they were watching themselves 4 months earlier. 270 people now stood on the sand. Among the freight they had paid to ship across the Atlantic, a portable throne, dress uniforms of the Poyais army, and chest after chest of Poyais dollars currency for a country that was a rumor written by its own thief. The rainy season was coming. On the Mosquito Coast, the rains do not water the land, they weaponize it. Standing pools breed mosquitoes. Mosquitoes carry malaria and yellow fever. The settlers, camped at the swamp's edge, had been sold the deadliest ground in the region. A handful of the strongest took the remaining boat and worked the coastline toward British Honduras, a desperate open water errand that succeeded. Word of a starving settlement on the Black River reached Belize. Remember that boat. Every survivor of Poyais owed their life to it. They sickened by families. Fever took the strong as easily as the old. The camp's doctors, real doctors, recruited for a real hospital in a fictional city, worked with what a trunk could carry and buried their own colleagues. A sawyer named James Hasty, who had sailed with his wife and 3 children, later published a plain, devastating account of those months. It records the sequence exactly. Rains, fever, the healthy too few to nurse the sick, and burials that outpaced the digging. The man engaged to run the Bank of Poyais, who had exchanged his savings and other people's into MacGregor's paper, worked grave duty like everyone else. There is no record that anyone on that beach ever spent a single Poyais dollar. There was nothing to buy and no one to sell it. The man appointed official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais, understood before most. He had spent everything. He had told everyone. There was no princess, no palace, no shoes to make, and no way home. He shot himself in his tent. His name barely survives in the record one line in survivor accounts. But hold him in mind whenever this story tempts you to admire its architect. The con was elegant. What it did looked like this. In April, King George Frederick Augustus, the actual authority over that coast, learned what MacGregor had built on his signature. He was blunt. The grant conferred land, never sovereignty. He revoked it entirely. The settlers were now trespassers in the country Poyais had never been. The king did not abandon them. He offered the settlers his own protection if they would stay as his subjects, the empty savage coast of the guidebook turning out to contain the only honest government in the entire story. The one authority who never lied to them was the one MacGregor had lied about. Salvation came from Belize. The chief magistrate of British Honduras, hearing of a starving camp down the coast, sent a schooner. The evacuation ran in miserable relays through the sickest months. Some settlers were too weak to survive the rescue itself. They died in Belize, in the beds of strangers. The chief magistrate of Belize, Marshal Bennett, sent the schooner Mexican Eagle in relays through the worst of the sick season. Belize's small community absorbed hundreds of dying strangers, and its graveyards absorbed the ones for whom rescue came late. Some survivors owed 2 rescues, from Poyais, then from their own fevers. The arithmetic, as the record preserves it, roughly 270 people sailed for Poyais. About 180 of them died of fever, of hunger, of despair. Fewer than 50 ever saw Britain again. In October 1823, the first survivors reached London, and the newspapers detonated. Poyais was a fiction. The prince was a fraud. The dead were counted in the hundreds. The bond still trading collapsed. MacGregor's response was a masterclass in narrative warfare. Letters to the papers, blame for Colonel Hall, for the settlers' indiscipline, for agents who had exceeded instructions. The information vacuum worked in both directions. London could not verify the jungle, and the jungle could not answer London. The bonds told their own story, from trading respectably alongside real republics to worthless within months as the survivors' accounts spread. Thousands of small bondholders, none of whom had ever boarded a ship, discovered they had been settlers too. Just the kind who lose money instead of children. And now, the part of this file that separates it from every ordinary swindle, the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Some of the survivors, men who had buried their families on that beach, signed a public statement defending Gregor MacGregor. It was not him, they said. It was the expedition's managers, the guides, the weather, anyone, anything but the prince. Because to accept that Poyais was a lie was to accept what they had paid for it, and grief that size will bargain with anything, including the man who caused it. Con artists do not merely take money. They take the victim's judgment hostage because admitting the con means indicting yourself. The louder the sunk cost, the longer the loyalty. Madoff's investors reinvested. BitConnect's promoters kept chanting. The Poyais survivors petitioned for their prince. The survivors' signed statement survives in the record, and its essence is exactly this. Our misfortunes were not the fault of the cazique. Men who had buried wives in his imaginary country put their names to that sentence. If you take one thing from file number 1, let it be that sentence. So what did British justice do to the man behind 200,000 pounds of fake sovereign debt and a beach of Scottish graves? Nothing. He was never tried in Britain. Not once. He had, prudently, already crossed the Channel. Paris, 1825. And here, the story stops being a tragedy and becomes something close to dark comedy because Gregor MacGregor, with the graves still fresh, ran the entire scheme again. Same country, same book, translated. New constitution, new company. French investors, French settlers. The French version was, if anything, more polished. A new constitution Poyais was now a republic, its cazique restyled as head of state, a chartered trading company to receive investment. The scheme had been rebranded, restructured, and relaunched for a new market. Modern fraud calls this a pivot. It failed on a technicality he could not have scripted better. 30 would-be French immigrants applied for passports to Poyais. French clerks checked their atlases, found no such nation, and being French clerks opened a file. The greatest information vacuum con in history was undone by bureaucratic thoroughness. MacGregor was arrested and tried in France in 1826. The verdict? Acquitted. The paperwork was ambiguous. The witnesses scattered. An associate took the fall. He walked out of a French courtroom a free man and went back to Britain and started selling Poyais again. The trial's fine print completes the pattern. An associate, Lahoubi, took the conviction months in prison for the scheme's French paperwork, while the architect walked free on jurisdiction and deniability. Someone always holds the bag. The skill is making sure it is never the man who sewed it. Smaller offices, humbler paper. Poyais land certificates were still being hawked into the 1830s, a decade after the beach, to buyers who had somehow never heard from a man the newspapers had already ruined. The scheme did not die of exposure. It died of exhaustion. He even attempted another full-scale loan in the late 1820s, hundreds of thousands of pounds against the same phantom state. It failed. Not because London had grown wise, exactly, but because Poyais, at last, had a track record. The one thing no fraud survives is its own sequel being reviewed. By 1838, London had finally grown too warm, and the old general made his last reinvention the truest one. He sailed for Venezuela, presented his Liberation War record, and asked the republic he had genuinely served to take him back. Venezuela said yes. Citizenship restored. Rank of general confirmed. A state pension. When Gregor MacGregor died in Caracas in 1845, he was buried with full military honors and the cathedral mourned as a hero of independence, which for 1 month of his life, he had been. His Venezuelan petition leaned entirely on the one true story: Ocumare, the retreat, the Liberation War. Not a word of Poyais. The Republic, grateful and far from London's newspapers, restored his rank and granted the pension. He spent his last years as what he had always claimed to be, a respected general. One true story, carrying a lifetime of lies, all the way to a cathedral floor. The shoemaker got a plank in the sand. Nobody was ever punished for Poyais, not in Britain, not in France, not anywhere. Total legal consequences for roughly 180 deaths, none. Well, let's close the file the way this channel always will, with the mechanism laid out plainly, so you can see it coming when it wears modern clothes. 1. The information vacuum. Poyais lived 4 months' sail from its investors. Today, the vacuum is a foreign factory, a private ledger, an offshore fund anywhere your verification cannot cheaply reach. If you cannot check it, someone is pricing your inability to check. 2. Manufactured social proof. The commissions, the consuls, the flattered aristocrats, every stakeholder, a salesman. Today, paid influencers, celebrity advisors, a conference stage. The crowd around the claim is not evidence. It is usually the product. 3. The fabricated artifact. The Strange Ways Guidebook, 350 pages of confident, footnoted fiction. Today it is the white paper. The audit from a firm you've never heard of. The demo that only runs once. Documents are costumes. Ask who tailored them. 4. The legitimate wrapper. A real bank, a real exchange, real bond paperwork around nothing. The instrument being respectable tells you nothing about what's inside it. Regulated container is not regulated contents. 5. Extraction as procedure. The Poyais dollar exchange theft, formatted as a formality. Watch the exact moment your money changes form, into tokens, into credits, into anything that only spins inside their world. That moment is the con. 6. The hostage judgment. The survivors who defended him. The mark's own pride becomes the scheme's last line of defense and its best recruiting tool. The question that breaks the spell is never, "Am I smart?" It is only ever, "Have I checked?" Because that was the whole scheme. In 2 words, the phrase we started with. An invented country, sold in broad daylight, through the front doors of the world's most sophisticated financial market, and at every single step, from the fake knighthood to the fake nation, no one checked. What would have stopped it? In 1822? 1 letter. Any London merchant with a Belize correspondent could have asked a single question: "Is there a city on the Black River?" and received, 4 months later, the single word that would have saved 200 lives and 200,000 pounds. Nobody spent the postage. And its descendants did not change the mechanism, only the shipping times. The token presale is the land certificate. The white paper is the Strange Ways Guide. The locked exchange balance is the Poyais dollar. The influencer roundtable is the legation office. Verification is still the only vaccine, and it is still cheaper than belief. The Black River still runs to the Caribbean. The coast MacGregor sold as boulevards and opera houses is still jungle, still swamp, still, after 200 years, almost entirely empty. The land never lied, only the paper did. Poyais was the first time someone sold the market a currency for a thing that did not exist. It would not be the last. Next, in the files, a queen, a coin, $4 billion, and a stage in Wembley Arena. File number 1 is closed.